Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome to the Thursday edition of the Hugh Hewitt Show. I'm opening with the beginning of an interview, which I'll be playing throughout the show today. All of it will be over at my YouTube channel if you missed some of it. I think it's very important. Haviv Rettig Gur is back, senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's host of the Ask Haviv Anything podcast, which I recommend to you. You can support him at Patreon. And he's become kind of a go-to guy for me. Haviv, welcome back. Thank you for spending some extra time with me today. You hit me with a lot today. I listened to your Amanda Dan Borschel interview last night. Then I steeled myself and listened to your interview with Tal Shoham, which I was reluctant to do, actually. And I revel in dissident literature. I grew up on dissident literature, but that's pretty raw. How did you get ready for the interview with a released Gazan captive, even though he's been gone out from the tunnels for 8 months?
We know the family. And we've been following the family. My wife worked with them and was part of a larger campaign to get Tal and his family out. And this is a family, 8 of whose members, including a 3-year-old girl, an 8-year-old boy, and a 12-year-old girl, were all taken hostage on October 7th. So it's people we know and stories we know. And he's been extraordinary. He's said things about understanding Gazans and even forgiveness that are extraordinary. He also knew Arabic, and so he went in able to have a conversation that was a little bit richer and more serious about what the Hamas guys in those tunnels were thinking, talked about hearing them digging while they sat in those tunnels over the course of the 2 years the tunnel project actually expanded. So many thoughts, so many revelations from somebody who is just an astonishingly human and humane kind of person.
Among the many things he said was his relationship with God in that dark space, and he would talk to the darkness. I'm glad I listened to it, but I really did have to brace myself. I'm older than you are, but I think it would be a good thing for everyone to listen to that, because there'll be trials in everyone's life, but they're not going to be like that. That is as bad as Bukovsky in the Soviet psychiatric prison, or Amanda Valladares in the Cuban prisons, or Solzhenitsyn and Sharansky in the Gulag. That was quite a work of art. You said something interesting to me as well. Said the whole experience had radicalized you so that you wouldn't mind seeing every member of Hamas dead. That's how I thought after 9/11. Do you think that's going to change, and do you think that's generally the reaction within Israel?
The term Hamas signifies for Israelis a tireless demand driven by a religious vision to ensure that they are all dead. So Hamas, as distinct from Gaza, Palestinians, the Arab world, anti-Semitism writ large over the course of, 2,500 years of Jewish experience, specifically Hamas is something that most Israelis would be perfectly happy to see dead and are willing to invest quite a bit of effort to do so. But knowing and understanding the scale of their cruelty and how they see cruelty as a tool in a toolkit of war to an extent that is surprising. What do I mean by that? It isn't just that they want to completely destroy and annihilate the enemy. Their ideology, read the 1988 Charter, is absolutely, totally genocidal. They're explicitly genocidal. There's something adorable I mean that sarcastically, in people who, in defense of Hamas, deploy the term genocide about the Israeli war effort. You can, by the way, think the Israeli war effort is horrendous, but don't use the term as a defense for Hamas. Hamas literally, explicitly would like a genocide and say so openly. They're not cagey about it. And so if you are opposed to genocides, hating Israel isn't enough. You really kind of need to not be on Hamas's side of things. But Hamas is worse than that, because Hamas is willing not just to destroy Israel, it is willing to destroy Palestine. It is willing, it built for 17 years, we talked about this 100 times, Hugh, that tunnel system in which it basically is the most comprehensive bomb shelter system in the history of war, vastly larger and more comprehensive than anything ever built ever by anyone else. And not a single Gazan child has been allowed to step foot into any of the thousands of shafts and hundreds of thousands of kilometers of tunnel in 2 years. In other words, it's Gazans that it is willing to destroy on the path of this religious redemption that the destruction of Israel means. So these are people who want to murder my children and are willing to murder their own children on the path to murdering my children. I don't know if I needed much radicalization, but the hostage experience and the tortures and the starvation that they underwent and all of the things that they experienced, yeah, I think it took away some of my capacity to temporarily. I'm an analyst. I'm paid to think clearly. I try very hard. We all fail. I try very hard. It took away some of my desire to think around corners and see the deep humanity of Hamas and its ranks and its fighters and its people.
Tall spoke very movingly about the children of Gaza who've had no choice but to be brainwashed. I thought that was very humanitarian of him, and we'll come back to that. The reason I want to talk to you a little bit longer...
He's spoken about that... I'm sorry. He's spoken about that again and again, and he wants Israelis to hear that. And that's part of his message. And everything I've just said about Hamas, Gaza is a human society. And no human society is irredeemable. And people who think Israel is, way over the deep end and evil, no human society is irredeemable. And certainly I don't think that about Palestinians, and we mustn't ever think it about a society. And so when he speaks about children, I listen. He has more right to speak about Gazan children, than I do. He actually was tortured by their parents. And one of the fascinating things about his experience, by the way, I'm sorry to harp on, but I feel this very strongly. 200 days he spent in tunnels with Hamas fighters. But 300 days he was not in tunnels. He was in apartments. And he was held captive by families and by doctors and by people claiming to be journalists and things like that. And ordinary Gazans were around in different ways. He was marched through the streets a few times. And his experience of Gazan society was truly a horrific one, of everything dark and bad in that society. As a helpless person, totally dependent on their kindness. And he was tortured, and nobody cared, and everybody was part of it. And he comes out and says, we absolutely have to have that humanitarian impulse, that sense of sympathy and empathy and the hope and desire and plan for a new dawn with the children of Gaza. So it's yes, as you said, thank you for calling it out. And also it's a powerful thing when he says it.
It was. I've been thinking throughout that conversation as well about John and Rachel and their son who has not come home, Hirsch. Have you talked with them since the hostages were released? Have they spoken? Their grief must be overwhelming.
I haven't. I've heard them speak. I've heard her speak, especially. I don't. Yeah. I mean, I have no words. I have 4 kids, and I have no words.
So the reason I keep thinking about her is that if Vice President Harris had won, and that's a counterfactual, I believe Iran would have had a breakout so that they would have nuclear weapons on their missiles by now. And I believe that Israel would have been forced to stop a long time ago, and that Trump winning is the best thing that ever happened to Israel. Is that a widely shared point of view in Israel?
Trump is very popular in Israel. Yeah. After the Iran war, even more so. Israelis aren't always sure they agree with him. He's now waded into the Netanyahu trial,
right?
And all of that politics. But Israelis believe, and I think they're absolutely correct to believe this, that he gets it. He fundamentally gets the value of the Abraham Accords, of an Israel integrated into the region, of why Iran is the destabilizing evil side in this. We have a debate with the Trump administration about Qatar. The Israelis have a certain view. The Trump administration has a different view. That's fine. Not agreeing on everything is pretty much the only mark of a healthy relationship. You never should agree on everything. But the fundamentals, the existential threat Iran posed, the genocidal demand, the cult that the Iranian regime represents, the fact that it spent a double-digit percentage of its GDP on a 30-year plan to destroy Israel that all got wiped out in 12 days. The catastrophic incompetence of that regime, where all it can do is bring war and failure to the Arab world around it, and it can't actually build a new day for Iran. All of that Trump gets. And that's enough. That is way more than enough. So
but that's only half the question, Haviv. The other half is In her interviews since her memoir came out, Vice President Harris has made it clear she would have done more to stop the war. She would have not participated in Operation Midnight Hammer. And I believe, generally speaking, it's evident that the Democratic Party is in the grip of a growing anti-Semitic, certainly anti-Zionist and anti-Israel cadre of DSA with the mayors in Seattle and New York. And then on the right wing of the Republican Party, it's reemerged as well in a virulent form. You might only have 3.5 years of an American president on your left. Do you think about that?
Yeah, I think about it. It's part of our planning process. I hope smart people in government are thinking about it. We are a country that's capable of tremendous competence and tremendous incompetence. We've seen both in the last 2 years in plentiful supply. I do think we're thinking about it very seriously. I don't think anybody in Israel is panicking. And that's because of our history. Our relationship with America it's an interesting one. I don't know if you want to get into it, but...
Oh yeah, Eisenhower was so mad at you in '56. Oh boy.
It's more than that. It's bipartisan. I mean, in 1948, Truman recognized Israel within 11 minutes. Everyone celebrates that moment. But the Israelis had a lot to complain about because 10 minutes after that recognition, he placed an arms embargo. He placed an arms embargo on Israel that lasted for the duration of the 48 war. That was our most dangerous existential war. That was when we were just a third world community with barely had enough, did not have enough arms to fight. We ended up buying arms from the Czechs, who were given permission to sell us arms by Stalin, because the Americans and the British placed an arms embargo on us at that moment. Eisenhower, when he cracked down on the Israelis in '56 were pushing back the Egyptians. People should look up the Suez War of '56 to know what I'm talking about. But the French and the British wanted to retake the Suez Canal. What the Israelis wanted in that war was just the simple point, which is that the Arabs had suddenly united around Nasser. And for the first time, we were in a danger astronomically greater than we were in '48 when the Arabs were all disunited and unable to coordinate. When do the Americans actually become close allies of the Israelis? Under Kennedy, basically in the mid-'60s, when there's a suspicion in Washington that the Israelis might be building a nuke. And this strategy develops because they don't want to let the Israelis, swing out in the wind building a nuke in the Middle East that the Americans were trying to stabilize in the middle of the Cold War, where the Arabs had all turned, basically other than Egypt, had all gone to the Soviet side. So what they wanted to do, they decided on a strategy of a bear hug. Kennedy started selling Israel advanced missiles. Israel would know America has its back, and Israel wouldn't do a thing in the Middle East without coordinating with America. And that bear hug is basically the strategy today. America's real powerful, the alliance between the IDF and the Pentagon as a stabilizing force in the Middle East begins in the '70s. These are moments when Israel is already powerful. America has been our backup, our ally, our friend, after we were useful, not before we were useful. One of the strangest things about the anti-Israel campaign, especially on the isolationist right in America, is that they kind of have to argue that every American leader, planner, Pentagon planner, since Kennedy has been a moron, and that the only reason that America could possibly have allied with Israel for 60, 70 years is that everybody was hoodwinked by an Israel lobby, which in the 60s hadn't yet really gotten started. And so, no, there's actually a long, serious arc of American-Israeli relationship, which is foundationally and based and always has been, because Americans are not stupid, even if some American right-wingers claim so because they're trying to rewrite history to fit their little momentary political moment. It's always been based on Israel being useful. If America cuts us...
In my point of view,
yeah.
What I think could be, Israel is America's most important strategic ally, and that as the West gathers in for its long Cold War II against the alliance of tyrants, one of whom we crippled in the summer in Iran, but Putin and Xi are still there, and North Korea and Venezuela, and the alliance of tyrants is getting tighter, and the frontline states are the United States and Israel. And anyone who comes after that alliance is crazy. It's sort of like Britain and the United Kingdom and the United States in 38, 39, 40, we need each other. But there are a lot of Americans who don't get that, blinded by either anti-Semitism or misinformation or the pictures that Gaza runs, which brings me to an interesting question. For years, I've been doing this show for 25 years. Michael Oren has always been my go-to guy. Ambassador Oren is a friend. He's my age, though. And Dan Senor, since you were with me last, I've had on Nadav and Amit and now you. Dan Senor has done Israel an amazing public service. Do people know that he's basically the face of Israeli public diplomacy in America, introducing people like you and Amit and Nadav, the next generation of explainers to the American public? Are they aware of that in Israel, what Dan's doing?
Israelis are provincials. You're not gonna
Huh.
you're not gonna change that. I love them, but they're very provincial. There has been a catastrophic failure on the Israeli side
Yes.
to get a message out, to the point that Netanyahu doesn't even have an English language spokesperson. I mean, to the point, or that anybody can find or knows, to the point where there just isn't any. It takes Israel days to get answers to something that flashes across everybody's screens on TikTok. The foreign ministry is basically non-functional. Nobody even knows who the foreign minister is when you ask them out there in the world. The Israeli foreign minister used to be a very important person who was part of the decision-making process. No longer. So this is a colossal strategic failure, especially when the enemy foundationally basically thinks they're fighting an information war, far more than a war on the ground. For Israel to be confused about that point and only have fought a war on the ground is staggeringly incompetent. And people like Dan stepped into the breach and incidentally didn't tell the government of Israel's story. None of us. Amit Segal was just publicly castigated by Prime Minister Netanyahu today in a public letter of the Prime Minister over
I didn't know
domestic
that.
politics. Yeah,
Okay.
he's not a spokesperson of Netanyahu. We're all telling the story as we understand it. But it is at least a story where Israel is right to go after Hamas. And by the way, all of us, on the hunger crisis back in the summer, I came out about it on the Free Press. Amit Segal wrote a piece about it after that on the Free Press. Everybody then really kind of brought that story forward. Amit and Nadav, you should know, are on the left and right, roughly,
Right.
center left, center right of Israeli politics. So it's at least bringing something of the Hebrew language conversation that is really profoundly missing from mainstream American media, because the journalists who cover Israel in mainstream American media know almost nothing about it. All they really know is basically their own sort of political dogmas that they approach the conflict with. And again, you don't have to agree with me, but you should at least understand what Israelis think is happening to them if you're going to cover a story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there's this huge gap. And unfortunately, none of the efforts of any of us, I think, were enough. In the end, the Israeli government's failures to explain. By the way, some of the policies were also mistaken, terribly, but it never actually explained anything. And so the other side was playing against an open goal. And Israel will reap the results of that for many years, I think.
I think you're right, but I do think that the emergence of new voices from Israel that make sense on the American. I've tried to GPS all of you for the American audience. I call Amit a combination of Matt Continetti and Britt Hume. They're different generations, but they're center right. I think Nadav is Dan Balls, who is a longtime Washington Post Bigfoot political reporter, and I put you down as Israel's Dr. Krauthammer, who everyone has to kind of listen to. And that brings me to a big question, one that I asked Amit the other day. Are you going to ever go into politics, Haviv?
God, no. No, absolutely not.
Amit did not answer that way, by the way.
I wish him luck. One of the things that people don't understand about politics when they go into politics, and I have this conversation with more than one aspiring politician who's had some phenomenal success somewhere else and wants to change the country for the better and decides to go into politics, is that a junior politician doesn't get to set the agenda. A junior politician, the vast 99% of the time, Zoran Mamdani is an exception, and sometimes there are these exceptions, but the vast majority of the time, there's this river flowing past you of agenda items set by other people, and you dip into it and pull out the tiny little bit, trying to make a name, try and be seen. And you spend most of your time shocked at how useless and meaningless you've become after leaving this thing you do well and going into this political world where you have to sell a lot of yourself on the climb up. And by the time you reach the top, what's left? All of these kinds of questions. I think I'm much more useful to people trying to explain what's happening than asking them to vote for me to enact a policy that I need 600 different stakeholders to actually get done. That's not my skill set. I would be doing a disservice to Israel if I was a politician in Israel.
Well, you and I have the same point of view, and it's always been, I never wanted any part of it, but I wanted to ask just to have it on the record. Something you said on the, I can't remember if it's with Amanda or with Tal, is it's a safer country on paper, it's a safer country in reality, but Israel is still torn. Oh, you asked it of Tal. Can we find a path back to normalcy? You didn't answer that. He did. What do you think?
We we are a country that faces real crises, real divides, powerful ones, painful ones. We have a political elite that campaigns on those divides, lives on those divides, magnifies those fractures in our society. They are real, they're painful, they're not going away, they're not invented by the politicians, but a politician that needs them to survive politically is not going to be the leader who heals them, who reaches across them. By the way, not at all singling out Netanyahu. I do think Netanyahu plays that game, unfortunately, but it's very much the game of Yair Lapid over on the other side. It is very much the defining campaign of, I would say, 75% of the Knesset. And so we're a country that on all kinds of questions that people don't even hear about out, right? Israelis pay for consumer goods for just to live, just to eat a tomato, more than French and more than the Germans and more than other expensive countries. Israel has problems with minorities. Among Jews, there are divides between many, many different groups. Between Jews and Arabs, there are these huge fractures. The Arabs themselves have tremendous social problems, from including a massive organized crime problem. And all of these issues and questions are burning, and people are suffering from them. And we have a political class that doesn't really address any of them, doesn't really have the competence and the seriousness. We have a political system that doesn't incentivize problem solving. It incentivizes bickering. I know this sounds like every democracy today, but it nevertheless is also the situation Israel is in. And so we're torn apart. I mean, remember judicial reform before October 7? Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators week after week after week, a sense that democracy is collapsing on one side, a sense that the left wants to hold on to power undemocratically through the court system on the other side, everybody accusing the other one of being the end of the country. That level of fracture, that level of being set against ourselves, is still there. Now, our enemies, thankfully, we always like enemies for that reason. They reminded us that we desperately need each other and can't afford to fall apart. But that's not enough to heal. We actually need to do the serious work of healing. So yes, Israel has a lot of work ahead of it, a lot of questions that are real questions that have to be resolved. I don't just mean kumbaya, we all get back together and love each other. I mean, we have to figure out judicial reform. We have to figure out how our democracy works. We have to figure out what checks and balances rein in an enormously powerful Netanyahu that really can't be reined in by parliament structurally because of how our system works. And it can't be the most powerful court in the Western world that's unhealthily powerful. So there are fundamental questions, and a political system that doesn't really know how to answer them or even wants to answer them. It's a country, I think, at a turning point. I think it has to make some serious decisions going forward.
Oh, it has such a big decision ahead of it. You do not have a constitutional right to a free press, so you have a vibrant free press. Your conversation with Amanda, which I listened to last night and took copious notes on, because it's whether or not President Herzog ought to actually pardon Prime Minister Netanyahu at the request of President Trump. When Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, it really spared the country a great deal of ordeal. But then you went a level deeper, and you talked about the problem of the security apparatus mapping journalists. That does not happen here, or if it does happen here, it is a scandal and heads roll because of our First Amendment. And would you explain with the background? You got a lot of runway here. I want the American audience to understand how this is set up, and you're unfortunately going to have to unpack the Netanyahu trials, which have always seemed to me to be the most absurd things in the world, because you can't criminalize good press. You just can't do it.
Yeah. So let me start with a caveat that every right winger is going to roll their eyes at. I apologize,
Okay.
But I believe it. Netanyahu's behavior was completely inappropriate. He received vast amounts, I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gifts from billionaires who have assets in the country, own television stations in the country. And he claims this was all friendship. Now, when my wife was coalition legislative director in the Knesset for a few years, she worked in government. She had a government job. She once had a meeting with Google, with I think Google's lobbyists in Israel. Google has a very large operation in Israel, and they gave her a mug with Google's logo on it, and she had to get an approval from the Knesset legal advisor to take as a gift from this lobbyist a coffee mug with the Google brand on it. And so Netanyahu as prime minister receiving vast amounts of is simply not okay. It's inappropriate. It's unethical. It wouldn't stand up to any scrutiny of any person in it, anywhere below Netanyahu in the hierarchy. So I said that. Now,
Yep.
I also think his trial is absolutely disastrous for Israel. And it's disastrous far beyond the legal problems with it and the question of how much it's divided Israeli politics, which are important questions. It has forced Netanyahu into a political bunker he can't leave. It has forced the other side into a political bunker because any politician on the center left that now says, look, maybe we can form some kind of temporary truce on some specific issue in the Knesset, there's a blowback that says you're going to do a deal with a prime minister indicted and standing trial. It has forced a kind of polarization in the Knesset itself that I think is very damaging for the country. All of that is true, and again, that also I want to set aside. There is one piece of the trial, of the three specific cases against him. Case 1000, case 3000, and case 4000. Those are the designations given to these cases by the police investigators that just give names to files. Case 1 and 2, 1000 and 3000 are breach of trust and fraud cases. It's important, we should find out what the heck happened there. They're not cases with a potential ruling, a conviction for turpitude, meaning exceptionally bad crimes. There is only one case that is his most dangerous legal case where the potential prison sentence is years. And that's case 4000. And in case 4000, the basic argument of the prosecution has been, and legal analysts are going to hear this, professors of law are going to hear this, and I hope I get it all right. So apologies ahead of time, but people can look all this up. It's not that complicated. Case 4000 is the argument that when Netanyahu served as communications minister, while also being prime minister, he advanced policies that favored the Bezek telecom monopoly at the time in Israel. And the Bezek telecom monopoly was owned by a very wealthy guy named Elovitch. Elovitch also owned a media outlet, a news website called Walla. And the Walla news website, the prosecution alleges, was bent to cover Netanyahu very, very favorably in a quid pro quo in which Netanyahu would do for Elovitch things that improved Bezek's business position vis-a-vis the government. It had to do with regulation of internet infrastructure. And Bezek was the major provider of internet infrastructure at the time in Israel. And Netanyahu would do what Elovitch wanted. And in exchange, Elovitch's quite popular website at the time, it's very much diminished today, but it used to be one of the two biggest or three biggest websites in Israel, would cover Netanyahu very positively. That is the accusation. And the argument is that the bribe is media coverage. Now, conspiring to get a benefit in exchange, a personal benefit in exchange for policy decisions is, absolutely a legitimate arena for police investigation into corruption. The great problem for me, the danger I see in this trial, the reason I think that the Israeli media landscape, and especially center-left media, that has just locked into this and just decided that there's no danger for the press, and it's important Netanyahu have his comeuppance, and if he's a criminal, and we should all go after him. There's a terrible, terrible danger in the legal theory presented by the prosecutor that positive media coverage can be A, ascertained by the prosecution in the court, whether or not it's positive, too positive, more positive, less positive, and B, can count as a bribe. That is, you said, that there's Israeli state agencies, security apparatuses tracking media. At this moment, there aren't any state agencies tracking media. I have never, military correspondents reporting on troop movements have a military censor. I have never, ever, ever had to interact with a military censor in any way. I've said everything I feel like saying about every piece of legislation I've ever had. Nobody tells me any nuclear secrets, so I can talk about whatever I think I know. There is no censorship. There is no tracking. Except that there is now, for the very first time, a serious effort underway in the state prosecution handling this case to prove to a court, by sifting through Wallah's coverage during this period, that in fact the coverage favored Netanyahu and actually he was given the quid pro quo for the policy decisions that he made. That is so unbelievably dangerous. Two things about this that are important. One, this is a brand new legal theory. Nobody in Israel's history. There have been many corruption trials. There have been many bribery trials. Israel has a very robust investigative arm. Politicians can go to prison. We have a president who sat in prison. That was sexual assault. That was a rape trial. That's different. But we have Olmert. Ehud Olmert was prime minister. He went to prison for bribery. And it was bribery in dollars. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Envelopes of cash. Yep.
Just the envelopes, the bank accounts, all just tons of money. But never has anyone argued that media coverage can count as a bribe. And it's an incredibly dangerous thing to innovate with a sitting prime minister. If you want to test a legal theory in the courts, you want to say to the court, hey, I think this should count as a bribe. I want this to be a corruption standard. I don't think this is okay. That's not crazy. Prosecutors sometimes test new theories, but they don't do it in an adventure with a sitting prime minister. You start with a mayor of a small town. You start with a junior member of Knesset. You test the theory before sending the entire political system into a complete reorganization of itself because the prime minister has been indicted. To start with a completely innovative legal theory, and not just that, it's not just the first time that's ever been tried. That claim has ever been made, defining media coverage as bribery in the Israeli legal system. Apparently, a professor of law told me this, I haven't checked, it's the first time it's ever been tried in any Western democratic legal system anywhere ever. It is a completely innovative legal theory. And that's okay, again. But you start with legislation. You start at the very low level. You don't start with a sitting prime minister when you're innovating quite that much. The second problem, and this is the deepest problem, and this is what you were referencing. I have conversations with Israeli politicians. I have Israeli politicians who are my good friends. I've written essays about a friendship of mine with a particular Israeli politician who's currently in government. We were friends long before he went into politics. We met at a conference 15, 20 years ago. We have Shabbat dinners together. And not only that, I have often had conversations on issues I care about, telling them, hey, I think you should go a different direction. What little influence I have, I can tell people what I think. That's my influence. I'm going to use that influence. If you do what I think is right, I'm going to tell people, hey, this guy does what I think is right. Vote for him, support him. He's great. He's amazing. Do what I think is right. I will tell people you're doing what I think is right. Did I just bribe the guy? Did I just
No, you
tell
didn't.
the guy?
And you just described exactly, that's exactly how I've approached my job for 35 years on broadcast, television, and radio, which is to be honest about what I believe and to praise the people who do things I think is right and to criticize the people but I might be a little bit too partisan for you. You use that term. It's a fascinating. If I was teaching journalism this semester, I would use the conversation between you and Amanda to talk about journalism because you talked about it's okay to have a bias. Everyone's got a bias. You've got to be objective and honest with your audience, but don't become a partisan. I am a partisan because the divide between the Democrats and the Republicans is so significant now. I did endorse Andrew Cuomo because he was so much better than Mamdani, but that's about the only Democrat I've ever said something nice about in my entire career. Now, there are a couple or three or four others, but I'm a partisan. But everybody knows it. So it's not, I don't hide it from people. But if I got charted for what I said or that was considered a bribe, I'd have gone to jail 15 times over because I like people and I dislike people and I tell people what I think. Is that your approach?
Exactly. Hugh, you're describing the journalist-politician relationship. We're in a country with free speech, with a free press. Journalists are going to say whatever the heck they want. If the audience doesn't like them, they'll leave them and the journalist will collapse. There's plenty of failed media outlets that couldn't find their audience. That's the market that decides whether media succeeds or fails. The media expresses opinions. The media, the people in the media, journalists have opinions. They express, mainstream press in America, left-leaning mainstream press, has lost vast audiences because a lot of Americans can't find themselves in this coverage, can't find their problems in this
Correct.
coverage. If you have a newspaper on the East Coast of the United States that spent 5 years trying to figure out why anybody would vote Trump, never mind agree or disagree, literally diagnose what's happening, then that is a detached media outlet that is lacking the audience, and other media outlets will rise. There's a free market of ideas. But the idea that the journalist politician relationship in which we have conversations where if you support the things I believe in, I will tell that to people. That is not corruption. That is my social function. That is what people want from me. That is what my audience wants. Right? That's honesty. I don't hide my relationships. I advocate for them, and I advocate for my views, just like you're saying. So what this trial risks doing, and this I'll finish with, is we are on the precipice, on the edge. We can begin to see a situation in which, if the court accepts the legal theory of Case 4000 and actually convicts Netanyahu of a bribe, there's an extremely good chance Netanyahu then goes to prison. That's much less significant, even though it would be a shattering of Israeli politics. There'll be protests, and it'll be divide the country in half, and it'll feel like judicial reform, but worse. That's still less dangerous than the fact that police will now be told by the court system, you track media to make sure nobody is being too positive, because then you need to walk into that situation and figure out if there's a quid pro quo on policy. And that's hugely important. You cannot have the prosecution, the state prosecution. By the way, the junior prosecutors in Israel are uniformed police officers. That's just how the system works. It works that way in some European countries. You're not going to have cops tracking media to see if they're too much pro, or by the way, you can just be too much anti the opponent, right? You don't have to be pro the person you're working with. That's so dangerous. And it would introduce to Israel something that never existed, which is that literal tracking of press that you just warned about. So, yes, I think
what we call
is
it,
a disaster for Israel going forward.
what we call it in the United States. I've been broadcasting for 35 years, and I've been teaching American constitutional law for 25 years. I don't teach comparative constitutional law. I look at it. I don't pretend to understand your system. It's completely screwy to me. But we worry a lot about chilling effect. And what the government does cannot have a chilling effect on a variety of things, but most especially press coverage. Can't have a chilling effect on religion. It can't have a chilling effect on anything, especially not press. And when you explained Case 4000, and I also got to ask you, what happened to Case 2000? 1, 3, 4. But when you explained Case 4000 to Amanda last night, it hit me that Herzog ought to pardon Netanyahu, even though his answer to President Trump was, well, we don't do it that way here. He ought to do what Ford did with Nixon and spare the country this precipice and let people regroup. My God, you've been through a 2-year horrific existential war. It's not over yet. I want to go to that shortly. Do you think he's got it in him to rise above? He gave the rote answer. That's not how we do it here. Maybe he should make an exception to how you do it here, if in fact you're right, and I think you're right.
His powers of pardon, just legally, it's not easy. His powers of pardon are much weaker than the American president's. It is a recommendation process that happens inside the executive branch and in the Justice Ministry. And then I apologize, I don't know the process well. From my understanding, literally from reading Israeli press about this question, because Trump has raised it repeatedly in the last few weeks, and we're all trying to brush up on it real quick. It's just that first of all, the defendant has to acknowledge guilt, and it's a forgiveness of a crime as given to the president as a check on the judiciary. It doesn't replace the trial. That's the theory of it. There is some kind of preliminary pardon process that has never been used, but may be legal in Israeli law. So part of the problem, and Herzog's problem, is it's not at all clear he has the specific power to do it at this specific stage of the process. Trump, I think, thinks of this as a pardon with a president, so it's exactly America. It's not exactly the American system, and I don't know to explain in great detail those differences.
I don't expect you to, but I'll just add.
Yeah.
In 1974, a president had never been pardoned before in 1974. Gerald Ford did it, and he went outside of the system. We have a pardon attorney at the Department of Justice. There's a long process like the one you just described. Ford said, no, we're not going to do that. It's in the best interest of the country that we put this behind us and move forward. And 50 years later, everyone is glad that he did it, though he suffered politically at the time, probably lost the presidency because he pardoned Nixon. I don't often recommend books to Israelis, but if you read one book to explain warfare against political people, it would be The Nixon Conspiracy by Jeff Shepard, Geoff Shepard. Took 50 years to get the details out of the National Archives about the weaponization of prosecution of political figures, the forced resignation of Richard Nixon. We don't ever want to do that again. I would hate to see Israel do it. So Herzog, what Trump is doing is basically saying, I've been persecuted for 4 years. It destroys a country, but it's very hard to resist doing it to your enemies then. And if your Supreme Court's already all powerful, your Attorney General is kind of crazy, your chief military prosecutor made everyone think she committed suicide and dropped her phone in the ocean. It's all crazy, and you're in a war. Do you feel like that's all like a carnival, that they're over here having a carnival when there's an existential threat that's still in the tunnels of half of Gaza?
Yes. The corruption is deep. The weakness of our elites runs very deep. It is, we talk about Netanyahu because Netanyahu is the most consequential person right now in the Israeli elite. It absolutely is on the other side. It is in the courts. It is in just about every institute. We saw on October 7 just how much hubris and just incompetence are in the top of the security services. And by the way, security services that also know to deliver the 12-day Iran war. In other words, are tremendously competent, but the culture of leadership is weakened. And I'll just say this is something that we've been suffering from for decades. This is, Ehud Barak had these kinds of trials and tribulations and corruption charges, and so did Ehud Olmert. So it's a whole generation of Israeli leaders, multi-partisan, that do not behave like this is every group in Israel, every population, every, the high-tech industry, the military officer corps beneath the top generals are these unbelievably competent, amazing people delivering the high-tech, extraordinary thing that Israel has become. The people at the top are not, and it's a shame, absolutely.
So I listened before we talked today to Dan Senor talking to Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman. They're my generation, Daniel and Yossi, and they talked about the original founding of Israel and how it was to be an ingathering and it was to be a place of defense, and they got to get back to that. And they held up Naftali Bennett, who I don't presume to know anything about except that he made a big jump when he signed up with Yair Lapid and did the coalition government that lasted 2 years. After I read Amit's book, I gather it's not unusual for coalition governments to stab each other in the back. Is that your view, that to get to the other side, you need a Naftali Bennett and this generation that fought this war this way to get past the past 10, 15 years of civil division in Israel?
We need a new generation. Netanyahu's behavior in the last 2 weeks has been corrupt. There's absolutely no reason a single listener of yours would know this, but there's some public institutions in Israel, the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, a few of these old Zionist institutions that still handle some, they own 2,000 properties in the country, so they still have a large budget, so they still actually do things, including running the biggest youth at risk program in the country. They're just big NGOs in Israel, and the government has some small say. It has half of the board of some of them. It has some say in who leads who. And Netanyahu has been working to appoint his son to the leadership of them. His son Yair, who has sat out the entirety of the war in Miami, not been part of the Israeli experience, not been part of the suffering of Israelis, didn't serve in the army. And Netanyahu is trying by hook and by crook to... Now, there was such an angry upswell. One of the things that led to Netanyahu coming out against some of his top supporters, journalist Inoon Magal, journalist Amit Segal, just today, was that they critiqued him for trying to shoehorn his son, who sits in Miami not doing a damn thing for anybody, excuse my French, into a major top position in these very large important Israeli NGOs while not being in Israel and while not being part of anybody's experience over the course of this war. So we're still seeing, and again, it's a generational thing. There will be a new generation of the young high-tech people, of the extraordinary, unbelievable civil society, ultra-Orthodox civil society, the biggest medical charities in Israel or ultra-Orthodox charities. Over there, we have a lot of fights over, economics, over them getting jobs and over them participating in the draft and all this stuff. But they, as a society, have such enormous strengths that we all ignore because when something works, you don't talk about it. There'll be a new generation of Israelis, the current 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds. When they take the reins of this country will begin to soar. And it is already a country that is soaring. And it is soaring despite a lot of the problematic leaderships that it has had. This country will actually see, I think, a new day and a new birth of success. I don't know specifically about Naftali Bennett because Naftali Bennett has a particular political problem. I have a lot of respect for him personally. He has said the things that I think should be said in many cases. He has certain political views you can agree or disagree with, but just as somebody who believes in unity and then acts on it and suffers political costs for it, that I do support. I wish I would hear that from Netanyahu. But Naftali Bennett's problem is that the people who agree with his views don't trust him because he went to build a government with Yair Lapid. And the people who disagree with everything he stands for are the ones who trust him and wish he'd be in government. And so he has this kind of, the Venn diagram of the people who trust him and the people who agree with him has almost no overlap. And so I don't know that he actually has a capacity to actually win an election. Maybe he'll prove me wrong, but I don't think he specifically is the guy who's going to lead Israel out of this, unless he finds some clever political solution to that. But there will be a new generation that will not be what this generation has.
Haviv, you did high school in America, so you probably know we had a second founding. We had our first founding in 1776 through 1789, the adoption of the Constitution, and then the Civil War, and Lincoln actually called it a second founding at the Gettysburg Address. So a second founding comes after about 80 years, and hopefully you get it right. But you're going to need a Constitution at some point, because a Supreme Court that is supreme and intervenes and makes up its mind like that's not the rule of law, that's the rule of 14. And it's just not good. Now, I want to close by going back to your trip to London and the current war in Gaza. By the way, thank you for the shout out for Ohio State University. I'm from Ohio. Very proud of that university. Very proud of the fact that you had singled out with Amanda with Indiana as having very robust Jewish studies programs, because it does, and people are very proud of that. Ohio's got a great Jewish community in Cleveland, in Columbus, in Cincinnati, and it's a great strength of ours. I was alarmed by what you said. 2/3 of British Jews don't feel like there's a long-term solution for them in the United Kingdom. Does that mean they're going to come to Israel? Does that mean they're going to live in fear and hide and go back to the shuttle? What's it mean?
I mean, I hope so. We'd love to have them. These are talented, educated, first world trained, lawyers and engineers and doctors. And yes, I suspect there will be quite a lot of competition for them. America would love them too. So yes. I hope you guys fail to attract them all and we win that jackpot. I'm speaking a little bit jokingly, but imagine a Jewish community, utterly integrated, deeply proud of being British, that feels such a psychological pressure. There's actually a murder at a synagogue on Yom Kippur. I mean, yep. a gunman, because of his Islamist religious philosophy, opened fire on a synagogue and killed people. But it goes beyond that. That frames the story for 200,000 British Jews, because the hatred they sense all the time, everywhere, constantly, on campuses and in the press and in the streets and in just the politeness of society. There's in Britain, in British society, I don't know much about it. I never lived there, but visited a few times, watched the BBC. There's a whole culture of propriety and a whole culture of what is and isn't within the appropriateness and the camp. And it's a whole elitist kind of culture that is very old and is part of who they are. And I think it's adorable. Jews are being excluded from it. They're being excluded from that, right? And British Jews are a little bit more, because of history, a little bit more traditional than American Jews. They come from a slightly different place in Eastern Europe at a slightly different time. Britain closed its doors in different ways. And they're a little bit more traditional, a little bit more Orthodox. On the other side, those who are not Orthodox are much more secular. A lot of the middle ground of conservative Jews, Reform Jews that you have in America, you don't have as much. They exist, of course, but they're not as big and significant part of the community. And so you have British Jewish identity that is both more conservative and more liberal. more integrating and left wing, and also more just traditional and built into these tight knit communities. They're all feeling it. You know, I talked to a group of college students. I was just in London a couple days ago for a couple of days to give a talk, and I talked to some college students, and they talk about, you know, picking a university based on there being enough Jews that if things go bad on campus, they have people to hide with, they have people to hang out with, and not be in the larger socializing of the campus because it would just not be safe for them. They would not be comfortable for them. It's an emotional toll to constantly be on trial, and they're constantly on trial. And what's shocking to me about that is if you told a British person today that Muslims in Britain should stand on trial for bad things done in the Muslim world, genocides with hundreds of thousands of dead, millions of dead, some of them underway at this very moment, everyone would call you a horrific Islamophobic bigot. And they would be
Right.
correct. British Muslims have nothing to do with the violence in the Middle East or the violence in South Asia. They have nothing to do with it, even if the people perpetrating that violence are doing it in the name of all Muslims and in the name of Islam. And so the very idea that if you oppose the Gaza war or you think the Gaza war is bad enough, you can come to British Jews with a demand for a purity test. That very demand to say you're not Zionist. What do you mean you're not Zionist? Half the Jews of Earth speak Hebrew because that's the only way they could survive the 20th century in the Eastern Hemisphere. What do you mean I'm not Zionist? I don't want them to exist? That whole discourse is so profoundly, profoundly bigoted. And it would be obvious if it was any other minority. And that's what those Jews are going through. And 2/3 of them tell mainstream pollsters that they don't know if there's a future for British Jews in Britain. That is where Britain is at today. That is nothing like the polling, by the way, in America. It's not within an order of magnitude of that in America. British Jews are really genuinely suffering. Something has gone very bad in that country.
The situation in America is, I believe, the situation that it was in Great Britain 30 years ago, and that we have to stop it and build a wall against it for strategic purposes, but also because it's what America believes in, is First Amendment, free exercise of religion, no discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, and that's our core principle, and it's eroding very rapidly on the left. It's eroded some on the right, but that's a perennial problem on the right, going back to the 40s and the 50s that Buckley had to purge once, and he did. Now, I want
Let me
to
just
close
add to
with
that, Hugh.
Go ahead,
Hugh, I'm
please.
sorry, I completely agree with what you just said, but I also want to add to it. There's often talk about how Jews are the canary in the coal mine. They're the canary in the
Yes.
coal mine in Britain. If Jews feel that way about Britain, it is not a coincidence that that experience of the Jews of Britain correlates with the fact that the British economy is in decline per capita. In fact, Israel has passed Britain in GDP per capita. Britain is actually a country that's gone into a very slow, very gentle decline, kind of a slow tailspin. And British governments over the last decade and probably for the next 20 years are basically committed not to changing anything, but to managing decline. And so when a society turns on its Jews to the point where that's the Jewish experience in that country, forget about the Jews for a second. I'm going to think about Jews. I'm Jewish, but forget about the Jews. Look at the country. Because if the Jews are feeling that way, something is deeply wrong in that country that's far, far bigger than Jews.
That's why I write repeatedly, Haviv, that our most important strategic ally is Israel, because the United Kingdom is no longer that ally. They have lost. They have the same power instruments that Israel does, meaning nuclear weapons and a military that can do a lot. Israel's military can do more, but they lack the will to project that unless it's an absolute necessity. Tony Blair spent it all, and they won't regather that in for decades, if ever. Israel is our frontline ally. It's that simple. And Japan and Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific, but in Europe and in the Middle East and maybe in Africa, it's Israel and the United States. Do you agree with me, by the way? That's my assessment of the globe. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. And I'll say even more than that. Israel will be your ally even if you let it go, even if you detach from it and, you know, toss it. Israel supported the US led world order when Israel was led by communists, by socialists, by Ben Gurion and the Mapai Party, which literally stands for the Workers of the Land of Israel Party. They were socialist. Stalin sent them guns in 48 because he expected them to be a vanguard of the Soviet, communist revolution in the Middle East. They did believe in Soviet communist revolutions. They just didn't believe in Soviet Union and Stalin. And they sided with America, even when ideologically they were on the socialist side. Israel has never not supported America. And the reason, even when America hated it and actually stepped on it, not hated it, but didn't support it and stepped on it. And the reason is that Israel, the Jews of the Eastern Hemisphere, never mind Israel, the Jews of the Eastern Hemisphere know, in a way that probably nobody else on earth knows, that the American-led world order since the Second World War has been the most peaceful, the most prosperous, the safest, the best that humanity has ever been. And there is no data point that doesn't prove that. And so Israelis will love America, hope for America's well-being, support America's, struggles in the world and strength and future, and they'll do that because that's the best future for humanity. And everyone saying otherwise is an idiot who has to build vast, intellectual structures to hide the very blunt, simple fact that nothing has ever been as good as the American-led world order. And I don't know an Israeli who doesn't basically think that way about America. So it goes way beyond partisanship, Trump, Democrat. It's even if you throw us overboard, we're still going to be that ally in the Middle East, and we're still going to be useful because we know the difference between a world led by America and a world that America no longer leads.
No, Israel and America are the West. There are other parts of the West that aren't in the West, like Japan, but they're in the West. That brings me to the penultimate question. The war in Gaza is not over. Not just the 200 Hamas terrorists tapped inside the yellow line, but you've got thousands of Hamas terrorists in the 49% of Gaza that isn't destroyed. It's Gaza City. And when we won World War II, Germany was leveled. Japan was leveled. And your hostages are out now, Haviv. Can you afford to allow Hamas to remain, even in its weakened, decapitated of its primary leadership position? Can you not finish the war?
So I'll try and lay it out. What Israelis I think are thinking as best as I can see. If I want Hamas removed from Gaza because I care about the future of Gaza. My own kids' future will be affected by the future of Gaza. Good future for Gaza of rebuilding, of using the natural gas that was discovered off of Gaza's territorial waters, of just a bright, prosperous, happy future as a Mediterranean emirate that everybody flies to and goes on vacation in, would be an amazing, amazing boon to the future of Gaza, to the future of Israel, to the future of Palestinians, to the future of Egypt. Everybody in the region wants it. And Hamas remaining in Gaza prevents it. It prevents people from sending in $100 billion to rebuild and, 1 million tons of concrete and all the rest. It prevents a fast rebuilding and a better future. And it prevents it because Hamas won't give up its permanent forever war. So basically what you have now is a situation in which the Israelis got out the number one thing they needed, which was our own people. We don't leave our own people behind, and we will burn a path to them anywhere on earth to get them out. We are the Jews who defended each other, and that was when we stopped dying. And so that is the thing that the Israeli public needed this whole time and got. And now Netanyahu, basically, if he wants to resume the war, he has two problems. One is Trump really wants the war to be over. He wants to move forward with the Abraham Accords. He wants his own legacy to be ending the Gaza war. But Netanyahu's other problem, his deeper problem, and I'm saying this, by the way, even if he agrees with this ceasefire, which I suspect he does. I'm not even saying he doesn't. But if he wants to resume the war, he will find a deeper problem than Trump, which is that the vast majority of the Israeli public refuses, including his own base. Most Israelis, including most Likud voters, don't want the war to resume, especially if it's not to get our people out, which was the thing that was keeping Israelis willing to tolerate this war. This war has exacted massive costs from Israeli families and households. Not what Gazans have gone through, obviously, but much more than what most societies go through in this kind of a war. And so I don't think the war is coming back. Basically, the way it would have to play out among Israelis is we would have to go and sacrifice and have soldiers die, and families, businesses would shut down, and families would, lose their husbands and their brothers and their fathers for 100 more days, so that we could basically go back into Gaza so that we could rescue Gaza from Hamas. That would be the reason to resume the war. And to a lot of Israelis, that doesn't make any sense. Why would we rescue Gaza from Hamas if Gazans don't want to be rescued from Hamas? Or if nobody else is willing to die to rescue Gaza from Hamas, including Palestinians. And so I don't think the war is coming back. Domestic politics rules that out. And now we basically have a situation where Hamas will rule the half of Gaza it retook, killing all of its dissidents and its opponents. And Israel will control the band around the Israeli border and control the border with Egypt to prevent smuggling and continue hunting for tunnels. What basically that means is Netanyahu has won. He lost, he did not get the victory he talked about and claimed, the total victory in the war that he was constantly hammering on about for 2 years. He got, however, what I think is the only victory available to him, and he won it completely and spectacularly and comprehensively and totally. And what is that? On October 7th, Hamas was an Israeli strategic problem. It was a front vanguard for the entire Iranian proxy system, for the Muslim Brotherhood arc of the Middle East, planning our destruction, arming in the hundreds of thousands of missiles on our borders, on 7 borders, 5 borders, whatever it was. Hamas was that vanguard, that spearhead into Israel, and willing to sacrifice all of Gaza for the war. And that's a terrible strategic danger. Hamas now, 2 years later, is only a liability for Gaza itself. It can't present that threat to Israel. The allies are shattered. They'll rebuild, but we'll shatter them again. Believe me, they're the kinds of incompetent ideologues that we will actually be able to shatter again. And now,
well,
Hamas.
That reminds me of the Japanese soldier in the jungle. All right, that reminds. Yeah. Okay, you've got the Japanese soldier in the jungle doesn't know the war's over.
All Hamas can do now is hold Gaza's own future hostage. There are no more Israeli hostages in Gaza. There's a couple of bodies that we're going to get, or hopefully they'll find. There are no more Israeli living hostages in Gaza. Gaza is now held hostage by Hamas to the bright future, kept from the bright future that everybody wants for them, including Israeli strategic planners, by the way, but also the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Qataris and the Americans and the Europeans. Everybody's eager to get in there and rebuild and build a new Gaza and a new day without the damn tunnel system that's almost as big as the cities themselves, without a Hamas that rules it and is willing to destroy it on the altar of the destruction of Israel. Hamas prevents it. So Hamas is now Gaza's great obstacle, not Israel's. And that's a victory in this kind of war.
All right, my very last question. You're on Patreon. People can support the work that you do. I listen to every Ask Haviv, anything. I listen when you're on with Amanda. I think you're the voice. And I love Amit and Nadav and Yossi and Daniil. I listen to them as well. And, of course, Ambassador Oren. What is your mission? What do you think your job is long term, other than being a husband and a father?
I discovered in this war, I'm too old for the Army. The Army kicked me out about, 5-6 years ago. My entire generation in my battalion was deemed to a bunch of old fogies, and there were a cohort of young paratroopers, and so we were kicked out, and we all went through a terrible midlife crisis. I bought a guitar. It was really bad. And then this terrible war began, and I discovered that I can be useful basically to the Jews of the world, English-speaking Jews who take an interest in the issues that I discussed and talked about. But one of the things I discovered from visiting college campuses and from online talks that went surprisingly viral for an hour and a half, lecture on YouTube, is that there's a desperate hunger now for history and for knowing our story and understanding our story. For example, if you know that we are refugees, we are a nation built by refugees. 90% of Israeli Jews, their grandparents had to leave and had nowhere else to go in the 20th century. That kind of changes your assessment of Zionism, of Israel, of Israelis, of Israeli culture, of how they understand the 80 years of exterminationist rhetoric directed at them. It doesn't, by the way, exonerate them of anything. You're not going to then suddenly decide that some airstrike you thought was a war crime is no longer a war crime. I don't need people to agree with Israel. I don't need people to stop criticizing Israel. But this ideologue's attempt to argue that Israel shouldn't exist, that the founding of Israel was a great crime, that the millions of Jews who live in Israel who literally had no other choice. And if you don't believe that that's the case, just go to the lecture and then come at me after fact-checking, because it simply is the truth. That is something nobody understood. Nobody really knew. There wasn't a serious discussion of Israeli history. And once you get deep into the history, certain things become very clear and very unavoidable. And I discovered a bunch of Jews, millions of Jews, terrified at the world turning on Israel, feeling that they're identified with Israel. They themselves feel close to Israel because it's the other half of the Jews. But that whole relationship has to be mediated through other people's versions of their story. The Jews of America and the Jews of many other lands, but most of the Jews live in America outside of Israel. The Jews of America have spent 5 generations forgetting their history. They literally, these kids, they don't know, 250,000 Jews were killed in the 40 years of the great pogroms after the Tsar was killed in 1881. And 2.5 million Jews flee. Those are the core demographic base of American Jewry. And all of that horror and all of that historical experience that shaped who American Jews are basically reduced in the American Jewish historical memory and imagination to fiddler. And so American Jews have spent 5 generations in America forgetting who they are and where they come from. And when they know the history of the Jews, of themselves, of Israeli Jews, they become invincible to the war on them, to the war on their identity, to the war on their story. And again, I'm not in the business of defending an Israeli government action of any kind. It's a terrible war. There's a lot of cost paid by civilians. I don't step into that conversation. And I'm in that conversation as a journalist. I was part of the hunger question. It took a big part of the debate because it was really important, because something was happening, all that stuff. But I don't demand anybody change their politics. But you can't demand Israel be destroyed or shouldn't have existed or should never have been born. It's simply ahistorical, ignorant, or actually genocidal. And teaching American Jews that, I have discovered, A, there's a desperate hunger for this history, and B, that it's not being provided. You know, one of the problems that I've seen in these 2 years, and I think if it's true for Jews, it's true for everybody, is the terrible failure of American academia. And I don't just mean that it's a monoculture on one particular side of the political spectrum. I mean that there's this vast debate about history underway right now in America, in many arenas, about race, about other things. And the academics are mostly missing. You pay the salaries, including with your taxes, not that all of it is tax money, but some of it is, for thousands and thousands, a whole generation, a whole cadre, a whole class of intellectuals who don't then serve the people by providing deep knowledge in moments of real crisis and confusion. And that's certainly true for the Jews. And so being able to step in as a teacher has been my mission and goal. And that's now what I do with the podcast. And we're actually launching a new initiative, taking people's questions and answering them quickly, 3-minute video, 10-minute video out there on social media, to just literally try and get as much with history, with foundations, with book recommendations, with footnotes, with all the knowledge you need, just to get the information out there, because the other side steps into the breach, into that lacuna of American Jewish ignorance, and tries to tell the Jews' story for them. And so the Jews should be telling their own story.
That is a very good mission. I hope you keep in mind the non-Jewish Americans who are just as ignorant. I mean, we've lost history. I spend an hour a week with Dr. Arnn of Hillsdale College just mostly doing history, because we don't teach history anymore. So it's a wonderful mission. Where do they find the videos? I know where Ask Haviv Anything is on my downloads, but is it Patreon? Is that where they get the 3, the 5, the 10-minute videos, or are you putting them out on YouTube under Ask Haviv Anything?
They're going to go out on YouTube. They're going to go out on the podcast feed. They're going to go out on the Patreon, and they're going to go out on social media. I opened an Instagram account that's just snippets from the podcast episodes. We have 1.5 million, I think, views in 30 days. I mean, and came from nowhere. It's a brand new account. There's a desperate hunger for history. There's a desperate hunger for a serious telling of the story that isn't just ideological. There's a desperate hunger for knowing what actually happened without telling you who you should vote for. We're trying to fill that hunger. That's a very healthy hunger. People are not stupid. And if you give them the tools, they will reach conclusions different from you, but not so different from you that they're advocating crazy, bigoted, ridiculous things, which is what's kind of taking over in the absence of serious history and knowledge.
Now we need facts. Haviv Rettig Gur, thank you. Follow him on X at Haviv Rettig Gur. Subscribe and like Ask Haviv Anything. You'll also catch him occasionally at the Times of Israel, where he's a senior analyst, and at the Free Press. I don't know if he's working for CBS or not. I'm not going to ask him. I'll find out next time. Haviv, talk to you in a couple of months, and I always, always thank you for your time. You're very generous.